Okay, hold on. Okay. Hello, Steve. Okay. We are beginning. We are beginning on Daf. We're beginning Daf Nuchesam and Beis, about like 12, 15 lines from the top, where we left off yesterday. So we're just going to finish off one more piece of Gemara. The Gemara we just learned in the Mishnah, and just to recap, this Mishnah said a statement. Here's the Mishnah. The Mishnah said that a woman who's usher to a kohen and got engaged. So the Mishnah says that while she's waiting to get married, she cannot eat truma. Why? Because she's waiting on a bia pasula, something that's illegal marriage. So therefore, normally when she's engaged, after 12 months, she can start eating truma. Because she's engaged, let's say she's a grusha for a kohen, Reb Meir says she doesn't eat truma. Reb Shimon, Reb Lazar, Omer, and Reb Shimon and Reb Lazar said she could eat truma. Because as long as she didn't have the illegal marriage, in other words, she didn't have the marital relations of an illegal marriage, she remains a woman that's kosher and not banned from eating truma. Let's just begin. Shalach Rav Chanina Mishmeid Rav Yochanan. He says like this, a fascinating thing. You have three brothers. You have three brothers that are kohen. Let's say three brothers that are kohanim, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. And Reuven married a daughter of a kohen. Reuven married Moshe's kohen's daughter, as you can see in the picture. So Reuven married the daughter of a kohen. Then Reuven dies, so that Shimon, his brother, the kohen, did maimer on this woman. So Shimon technically is reserving Leah to be his Yevamos, but Mindrabanan, Levi, who's the third brother, is usher to have relations with Leah because she already reserved herself with maimer to Shimon. So she's almost waiting. She's like a lady in waiting for Bia Psula. So comes along Rab Chanina in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that whoever did Maimer, she already now becomes disqualified from eating Truma. Laman, who is this according to? Ilema l'Rab Meir. If it goes according to Rab Meir, this Ema da'amar Rab Meir, when does Rab Meir disqualify a woman from eating Truma? Because Mishtameres l'Bia Psula le'achla. When that somebody who's in waiting, a lady in waiting to do a bia psula, she's disqualified. She can't eat truma. That's only if she's waiting to have a bia psula. That's psula mid'oraisa, like a grusha who's engaged to a kohen hedyet. She's waiting, a lady in waiting to do a bia psula, which is pasul mid'oraisa. The Rabbana mi amar. It would, according to, if she's waiting for a bia psula that was only asad rabbanim, would Reb Meir say that she would not be allowed to eat truma anymore? That's not true. The Ella, the opposite case, Rab Lazar, Rab Shimon. So according to Rab Lazar, Rab Shimon, hashta mishtameres to be psula daraisa achlud rabbanim mibaya. If you're waiting for a bia psula midaraisa, even Rab Lazar, Rab Shimon says you could always eat truma. So if you're waiting for issa bia Drabanan, certainly you can eat truma. So who did Rabbi Yochanan say? That if you did maimer and you're waiting for a bia psula drabanan, you can't eat truma anymore? Ella, the opposite. Kiyasa Raven Amar Raven came and he clarified what Rabbi Yochanan said. Also, maimer be avimto. In the case if one of the brothers did maimer in the Yevamos, divrei hakol achla, she could always eat truma, even though she's already reserved for one brother. So she's waiting for a bia psula, but it's a bia psula drabanan, and everybody, Rab Meir and Rab Lazar, Rab Shimon, would both hold she could eat truma. But yeshle achala. But if one of the brothers was a chalal, a disqualified kohen who can never give truma or eat truma, so she's waiting for a bia psula for a posel da'iraisa, divra hakoel ein acheles, then everybody would agree she could not eat, because a chalal is very different than a grusha to a kohen hedyet, because a kohen hedyet could actually feed his normal wife truma, any wife truma, but the cholol can never feed anybody truma. He's a disqualified kohen. He's now like he himself can't eat truma, so therefore she would not eat truma. Like Nachlaku, the argument is El Shnos get. Instead of giving Maimer, he did a get for this woman. Rabbi Yochanan says if he did just give a get, that's only if you're waiting for Bia Psul Deraisa, Aval Rabbanan Achla. But if it's only a Bia Psula of the Rabbanan, you would eat. And here is by giving a get, now nobody can do Yibam with that lady. None of the brothers. So she's waiting for Issa. She's now a lady in waiting that potentially could have Bia Psula Midrabanan. So everybody, Rabbi Yochanan says it's only Bia Psula Midrabanan, so everybody would agree she could eat. Resh Lakish Amar Ein Eicheles, because he said she can't eat. Since when Reb Lozer Shimon gave you the leniency that you could eat is because technically in another scenario, the kohen who, let's say the grusha to the kohen hedyot, can give his can feed another woman truma. So in case he's engaged to a woman that's possible to him, we say, okay, he can give her truma to eat while they're engaged. But in this scenario, by giving a get, there's no scenario where you could feed a woman by just giving a get. And therefore, they hold einay cheletz. Sometimes you see when you give a woman a get, she goes back to her original father's house and can eat. But she's eating because she's going back to her father's house. But in this case, by a woman falling to Yibam and you give her a get, that get still doesn't absolve her, allow her to go back to her father's house. She's still connected, and therefore she can't eat truma. Okay, whatever it is, this just clarified a few things from yesterday. And today, right now, we're going to go into a brand new topic right now, and very interesting. Boya Menei Reb Chia bar Yosef Mishmuel. Reb Chia bar Yosef asked a question from Shmuel. The halacha is a kohen gadol has to marry a virgin, right? That you know from the Chumash, next week's parsha. Achri Mois Kedoshim Emar. Kohen Gadol has to marry V'hu Yisha B'Psuleho Yika. What happens? Shekidus is a katana. Now he when he made kedushin on the woman, she was a katana, so she's a psula. Ubagra tachtav, but now she became a mature woman. A mature woman, in other words, she's too old for Kohen Gadol to marry. Once she turns 13 years old, the Kohen Gadol can't marry her anymore. Kohen Gadol has to marry somebody 12 and a half, between 12 and 12 and a half. He could do kedushin on katana, but he has to marry her by 12 and a half. Here, the woman, he made kedushin correctly, but she became mature under him. And now she's not a real basula anymore. Maho, we go to Daf Nun Tes Amid Aleph. Basa Nisun Azla, do we go after when he's marrying her? And when he's marrying her, she's not a basula anymore. So it's not, he cannot marry her. Or maybe Basa Erison Azlin, we go after Erison. When he gave Erison, when he got engaged to her, she was a basula. So she was still a basula. So maybe he could still marry her, even though she turned into a mature woman by the time he's going to Nisuin. Amalei, so he answered him, Tenisuha. This is actually a Mishnah. Nisarmon is Garshum in Asum Psulis, Bida'eris Kesheris. The Mishnah says that if a Kohen was married to, let's say, a Grusha, so if they got married together, then she's forever puzzle. She's disqualified for ever going eating truma. Even if she gets divorced and she goes back to her father's house and her father was a Kohen, she had an illegal marriage and she did marital relations with that person, she's puzzle forever. Min ha'eris, and if she was only engaged to the puzzle person but never had consummated the marriage and never went to the chuppah, then she could go back kasherish, then she's kosher. So we see what's the determining factor that makes a kohen his wife is only when they have nisu'in, not when erisin. So also over here, so the Gemara wants to say is that the kohen gadol cannot marry this woman because when you're marrying this woman, she's a baigris. And just because you got engaged, Erison was a katana, but you're actually marrying her when she's a baigris. The nisu'in is happening, so it won't be a kosher marriage. Amalei, so he answered back, I have no questions that to call her a chalala, someone who lost the kedusha of kohen, is called a chalala. the only way, I have no question about that. The only way a woman loses her kedusha as a kohenes, right? If she's a daughter of a kohen, she could lose her kedusha of a kohenes only through the biyahu the mashva chalala. Only she had an illegal bia, illegal marital relations. Then poof, her kedusha of being a kohenes falls away. But kika mabayale. But I have a different question. V'hu, that the Torah tells you about a kohen gadol. V'hu, this kohen gadol, isha, a woman, bifsu lehu's a virgin, yikach, he should take her. What does the word yikach mean? The word yikach is ambiguous. Doesn't mean kicha the kedusha bidin. Does the Torah only require that the kedushin has to be when she's a besula, but the marriage can happen much later. Idilma, all the Torah means, did isuin be'inan, that when they get married, she has to be mamish 12 and a half. You can't, not a day later. Amalei, so he answered, let's just get the name straight. This was Rab Chia asking from Shmuel. So Shmuel answered, Hanami Tenisa, this is also a Mishnah. Eris es halmona, let's say, fascinating thing. A kohen got engaged to an almona. Nothing wrong with a kohen marrying, engaged to a widow, but all of a sudden he gets the appointment, v'nismana lias kohen gadol, and he became the kohen gadol. So now, technically, as a kohen gadol, he can't marry this woman. But the fact is that he gave erisin when he was a regular kohen. So the Brishta says yichnois, he can continue and marrying this woman. So what do we see from there? Right. So what's the difference? The Gemara wants to say, Sha'anu Hosam, over there, the difference. Why could he do that? Diksiv Yikachisha. It says that he could, there's an extra pasuk that says that we marba, that ki im besulav mi'amav yikach isha. The Torah says, yikach isha, next word, that he could take a woman that really was, right now, if he decided to get engaged to that woman, it would be illegal, but if he got engaged prior to being appointed to a kohen, it would work. So the Gemara wants to say, hachinami in this case also, ksiv isha, that since he got engaged when she was a basula or a katana, so we'll darshan that the kohen gadol did right. So when he marries her, he could continue on with the marriage, even though when he's marrying her already, she's a mature woman. So we darshan from Yisha to be marba our case as well. And says the Gemara, we only marba one case. Achas v'lo shtayim. We'll only marba one case, one exception, not two exceptions. We're only going to be marba the case when a kohen gadol did erison on a widow, and then he became the kohen gadol. We allow him to continue the marriage, but not the case of being engaged to a katana and continuing to marry her when she's a boigris. So Myra Isu, why not? Because the answer is very simply, Ha ishtanei gufa. Her body changed. In the case of when he engaged into a katana, when he wants to marry her, she doesn't have the same body anymore. She's not a basula. Her body changed. And therefore, that we wouldn't put that as the pasuk says, oh, it's okay. But the other case of when he did engage in almana, and then he became the kohen gadol, lo yishtana gufa, her body didn't change. She's the same woman. It's just now he became a kohen gadol, and now a kohen gadol can't marry an almana. On there, the Torah says an extra word, isha, take her. You're allowed to take her anyway, because you engaged with her prior to you becoming a kohen gadol. So the Gemara resolves that a kohen gadol, we know a kohen gadol has to marry a girl who's 12 or younger, marry 12 and a half or younger. If he got engaged to that girl and then she turned into 13, 14, he can't continue on to marry her. He has to give her a divorce. That's what we conclude over here. Next Mishnah. Kohen gadol, a kohen gadol, lo yisa almana, is not allowed to marry a widow. That's chumash. Bein min almana min erisin, bein min almana min asuin. Whether it's an almana that became an almana because her husband died while she was engaged to him, or certainly when the husband died after she was married to him. V'lo yisa es habaygeres. And this is what we said before. Tanakama, and that's the accepted opinion, that a kohen gadol is not allowed to marry a mature woman. He can only marry a 12-and-a-half-year-old woman or younger. Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon, machshir habaygeres. Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon says she could marry a mature woman. V'lo yisa And not only that, but Rabbi Elazar Shimon says, es mukas eitz. If she got injured and she lost her virginity, not because somebody had relations with her, then Kohen Gadol cannot marry her either. So we're going to discuss each part of this. Tanu Rabban, the rabbis taught, Almona Layikach, Bein Almona min Erisin, Bein Almon min Hanesuin. She cannot marry an Almona. Doesn't matter how she became an Almona, whether she was engaged or whether she was married. So the Gemara says, Pshita, why would I think any different? Torah says, don't take an Almona, you Kohen Gadol. Why should I think that there should be a difference? So the Gemara says, Mahu the same. I would have thought, Leilef Almona, Almona mi Tamar. We learn the word Almona from the Almona by the story of Tamar, Yehuda and Tamar. Malahalan, just like over there by the story of Tamar, she was an Almona min hanisuin. She was an Almona from after being married. She was married to Er and Oinon. Afkan, so I would think also over here when the Torah says a Kohen Gadol should not marry an Almona, it's only min hanisuin, only from an engaged from marriage and not from an engaged woman. Kamash Milan, no, it applies by both Almona from Erisin and Almona from Nisuin. Why not? Let us say so. So the Gemara says Dumya de Grusha. Because an Almona has to be similar to a Grusha. Kohen can't marry a Grusha, and a Kohen Gadol can't marry an Almona. Ma Grusha, just like when a Kohen can't marry a Grusha, there's no reason to differentiate. Bein min hanasuin, bein min erisin, doesn't matter. A Kohen can never marry a Grusha, whether she was married or just engaged and she got divorced. Alf Almona, so also Almona, bein min erisin, bein min hanasuin, an Almona, whether from erisin or from nisuin, a Kohen Gadol cannot marry that Almona. So all Almonas are off the table for a Kohen Gadol. Now, again, once we're discussing the topic, there's nothing in learning that's off the table in the Gemara. And here the Gemara is going to discuss an atypical bia. That means bia shaloi kedaka. That means if someone does relations on the back end, on the rear side. So that's what the Gemara is going to be discussing. And the Gemara is going to also discuss if a woman has bestiality, had relations with an animal, does she become usher to a Kohen Gadol? Let's read the Gemara. Mishnah's Tanu Rabban, the rabbis taught. The Torah says that a Kohen Gadol should marry a basula. Prat lo boigeres. She can't marry a mature woman. Shekalu lo basulah divrei meir. That means that her basulah were minimized. Of course, a mature woman has a hymen and she would bleed the first time, but not the same as a 12 and a half year old woman. So therefore, Rav Meir says that the Torah says Besulah means a total Besula, which is a 12 and a half year old. Rab Elazar, Rab Shimon Machshim Bebegeres. Rab Elazar, Rab Shimon says he could marry a mature woman. So the Gemara says, B'mai komi palgi. What are they arguing about? So we're going to learn over here that Rab Meir has a chumrah that a Kohen Gadol can only marry a woman that's a Besula, but not a mature woman. But he'll have a kula that a Kohen Gadol can marry a 12 and a half year old, even though that 12 and a half year old was subject to bia shaloi kedarka. She went through a bia not the normal way. So that's what Rameir learns from the psukim. Rameir says the Torah says besula. So the Torah would say just the word besula, afilu biktas besulim. Even a woman that has partial besulim, you're allowed to marry her. Mashma. But then the Torah wrote bisuleha, right? So the Torah wrote bisuleha. So by writing that, it implies that the Kohen Gadol is required to marry a woman ad the ika kol absulim. She has the most maximum possible blood virginity within her, and that is a 12 and a half year old. So that's what he dashed from besulel. But then the Torah says bivsulel, that she has her besulim and the extra bays. So we darshan bikidarka en, only if she lost the virginity in the normal way. But then she becomes usher. Then she becomes usher to the Kohen Gadol. Shaloi kedarka, but if she only had bia shaloi kedarka, not the normal way, then she doesn't lose the possibility of marrying a Kohen Gadol. So a Kohen Gadol can marry a 12 and a half year old, right? According to Rav Meir. And even if this girl had bia shaloi kedarka, she could still marry the Kohen Gadol. Comes along Reb Lazar Reb Shimon has another way to darshan the pasuk, and he's going to come out with a kula, which means that the Kohen Gadol can marry an older woman, but even an older woman, or no matter who, if that woman had any type of bia, kedarka, shaloi kedarka, it's also for the Kohen Gadol. How does he darshan the pasuk? They darshan Reb Lazar Reb Shimon Sabre besula shleima mashma. The Torah says that he should marry a besula. The Torah requires he should marry a total besula. Bisulah, but then the Torah says bisulaha, adding extra letters. Ba'afilu mixas besula. The Torah is mashma that she can marry even a woman that only has partial basulim. That means she didn't lose all her. She doesn't have the maximum blood within her. She's an older woman. She has less blood in her. So she has mixas basulim. So that's why Reb Lazar Shimon hold a Kohen Gadol can marry a begeres. Bifsula, the Torah added an extra bays, means kol besulah kayimim bein bekedarka bein shaloi kedarka, until she has, as long as she has whatever basulim she has in her is within her, but as long as she didn't do bia, any type of relations, whether kedarka shaloi kedarka, if she would violate herself and did bia shaloi kedarka, even if she has all the basulim inside of her, the Torah is telling you no good for a Kohen Gadol. So that is the machlekes between Reb Meir and Reb Lazar Reb Shimon. Comes along Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav said, a woman, okay, she's normally would be kosher for a Kohen Gadol. Let's call her this 12-year-old girl. Nivala shaloi kedarka. If she had bia shaloi kedarka, not the normal way, psula l'kuna, she's puzzled to the being the Kohen. Pashtus, that would be like Reb Lazar Reb Shimon. That she becomes usher to the Kohen because she had a bia shaloi kedarka. She's usher to the Kohen Gadol. So he seems that he paskin like Reb Lazar Shimon. Comes along Mosav Rava. Rava is going to ask a question from a brisa. Now, the Gemara is going to obviously say that even if you ask this question from a brisa, Yehuda Marav have the Tana Reb Lazar Shimon that goes according to them. But let's see what Rava asked. The pasuk says, this brisa says, "V'loi siyah isha." If a man rapes a woman, he has to marry her. Be'isha aruyiloi. He always has to marry her, provided that this woman is appropriate for him. That means there's no avera for marrying this woman. The prat, this excludes la'amana l'kayin gadol gusha chalutz l'kayin hedyot. That if a kayin gadol, imagine this, he raped a woman, he raped a 12-year-old girl, and this girl was an almana. So the Torah is telling you, normally, if you rape a woman, you have to marry her. Since he's the Kohen Gadol, he cannot marry this girl because she's an almana. That's the chiddush of the pasuk. So the Gemara says, "Hey chidami, what's the case? Ilema bekedarka, that this almana is an almana because she had that this Kohen Gadol raped her in the normal fashion. So even if it wasn't an almana, ma'ir mishum almana, tepik leibishum dahavya lel beula, that if a Kohen Gadol rapes any woman, he cannot marry her because she's a ba'ula. She doesn't have her virginity anymore. So Kohen Gadol can never. So what's the point that if she was an almana, even if she was not almana, he couldn't marry her? Elalav, what it means is that if the Kohen Gadol raped the woman, shaloi kedarka, so she didn't lose her basulim. And therefore, why would it be an isser for her to marry her? Is mishum almana en, because she's an almana. That's why he can't marry her. Mishum ba'ula loy, because she's a ba'ula, a woman that had relations that we wouldn't consider. Shaloi kedarka is not considered a ba'ula. So this is turns everything upside down, because Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav said that nivala shaloi kedarka, if you have bia shaloi kedarka, that's called a bia. So and she's possible for kahuna. And here we say that no, she would normally be kosher for the kohen. It's only because she's an almana. That's why the kohen gadol can't marry her. So the Gemara says, what's your question? How money? We go to Amud Beis, Testament Beis. How money? That brisa goes according to Rab Meir. Rab Meir holds that a woman who had bia shaloi kedarka is not permitted for a kohen gadol. The Rav, the Amek Rab Loza, Rav holds like Rab Loza, who holds that a bia shaloi kedarka is permitted for a kohen gadol. Ik Rab Loza, if Rav went ahead and paskin like Rab Loza, so why did Rav say nivala shaloi kedarka is psula for a kohen gadol? It's mashma by using the word nivala, right? That means the fact is that she had relations. That's what makes her also for a kohen gadol. Mari iri mishum ba'ula. Why do you just call her a ba'ula? Typically, the havyale zoina. she's now called a zoina. And a zoina is even worse. She would not only be asa for a kain gadol, she would be asa for a kain hedyet also. Because the Amar Rab Laza, and listen what Rab Laza holds. If you're going with the opinion of Rab Laza is very, very strict. Listen to this. Panu haba al pnuya. A boy and a girl had relations with each other. Not shaloi l'shem ishus. Not because they wanted to have, and they fooled around. It wasn't because of marriage. One time, asa zaina, she becomes a zaina, and she's asa for a kohen hedyet also. She's called. The Torah says that a kohen cannot marry a zaina. So even if a woman who had relations one time out of wedlock, nothing to do with marriage, she becomes a zaina. So if that's the case, why is it that Rav called this woman? She had a bi'iyah, a nivala, shaloi kedaka, she's psula l'koyin gadol, she's a zaina. The fact that she had a bi'iyah, she becomes a zaina, and therefore she's also even a koyin hedyet. Amar Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef comes along and says like this, that really, what does this mean? Nivalo shaloi kedarka, and not be called a zaina. How is it possible for a woman had atypical relations and is not called a zaina? Amar Rabbi Yosef kegoin shnivalo lebehema. She had a bia shaloi kedarka with an animal. And therefore, an animal that having relations with a human being does not make the lady a zaina. The Hassam, the only thing it can make her, mishim ba'ula ika. She's called a lady that had relations, but not called a zaina. Mishim zaina leika. She's not called a zaina because it's only with an animal. What makes a woman called a whore is only because she had relations with another human being, not with an animal. So Abaya doesn't like that. Amalei Abaya says, miman afshach. You can't divide this in part. If you consider her as somebody who has relations, because shaloi kedarka, atypical relations, is considered ba'ula, zainanama have it. So then, just because the animal did it shaloi kedarka, if it's called a bia, then she would also be called a zaina. If you say because she did it with an animal, she's not called a zaina, ba'ula name loihavi, then you wouldn't call her a ba'ula either. So, therefore, you can't divide it. The chitema, do you want to say, that, okay, let us not call her a zaina. But because we're going to say doing it with an animal is doesn't make you a zaina. But the fact is that if we said, Reb Lazar Reb Shimon holds that if a woman loses her virginity through mukaseitz, by being whacked by a tree or something like that, or a stick, so then she's also for a kohen gadol. So we'll call this a mukas h shaloi kedarka. That means she got whacked by a tree, but she didn't lose her virginity; it just went through the backside of her. So that makes her also for a kohen gadol. So the Gemara says, "Im kain ein lecha ishish ksher lekahuna shaloi nasas mukas eitz al yedei tzrar." What the Gemara is saying is that every woman somehow had rocks in her backside because she had to go to the bathroom, and she used rocks. In those days, didn't have toilet tissue. So by derivation, she had something there. She had foreign objects in her backside. So therefore, she would automatically, based on what you're saying, just because she had an animal dus nus there, if you call her a mukas eitz shaloi kedarka, then in that case, then every woman who had a tzrar rock by her backside should be called a mukas eitz and not be puzzled to a kohen gadol. So anyway, the Gemara drops this whole thing. So where are we up to? We have to find a case. A woman had a shaloi kedarka bia and is not with a man and is not called a zaina. How is that possible? A girl that was married to a man, a katana, and she was married to this a man midrabanan. Why? Because her father died, and her brother and mother married her off, so it's a midrabanan. And this man that she was married to only did bia shloi kedarka. Okay, he never had a normal relations with her, and then she doesn't need a get. If she doesn't like this man, she could say mimenes, I refuse, I don't want to live with him anymore. So she's not an almana. She's not a gerusha because she didn't get a get, because she has the right to just say, I refuse this man and walk away from this marriage, because the whole marriage was rabbanim. She's not a zoina because the marriage was kosher with rabbanim, and this bia happened shaloi kedarka. That is what Rav is saying. If a woman had bia shaloi kedarka and he's not a zoina, bia shaloi kedarka and not a zoina, still she would be puzzled to the Kohen Gadol, because she's called a ba'ula. Even though she's not called a zoina, she's called a ba'ula. And it's not considered a basula, even though she has all her basulim there. That's the point. She has all her basulim. She's 12 years old. But still, she had a bia shaloi kedarka. She's not a zoina, but nevertheless, she's also for a Kohen Gadol. Nu Gemara, let's just finish up over here, and then we're done. Amar Rav Shimi bar Chia. Rav Shimi bar Chia said, again, this 12-year-old girl, she normally kosher for a Kohen Gadol. Niv'ala lebehema. She had bia with an animal. Kisheira lekahuna. She could be kosher for the Kohen. For Tanya Nami Hachi. Niv'ala lemisha ein ish. If a woman got bia to something that's not human, that means she got bia to a man. Afal pisha beskila. Even though if she did it on purpose, we'd kill her, stone her, but Kishera lekehuna, she remains kosher to the kahuna. And look at the case. Ki also Rav Dimi Omar. Rav Dimi said it came from Israel to Bavel and told over the following story. Ma'asa beriva achas, there was this young girl, Behislu. She lived in this place called Hislu. Shahais, I don't know why. Shahaisa mechabedes azubayis. She was broom sweeping her house, and without realizing it, was against her will. Uva kelef kufri me'achareha. Came to this dog that's like a farm dog that's used to capture wild animals, a wild dog basically, and raped her from the back, a shaloi kedarka. So she has her basulim, but she was raped shaloi kedarka by a dog. So they bring this question to Rebbe. Rebbe says, she didn't lose her virginity, and it was shloi kedarka, but it was not a man doing it shloi kedarka, it was a woman. It was a dog. Rebbe made her even to be kosher to a kohen. Amar Shmuel ul kohen gadol. She could even marry a kohen gadol. So wait a second. Bimei Rebbe kohen gadol mihava. What do you mean she can marry a kohen gadol? During the time of Rebbe, was there a kohen gadol? Rebbe lived long after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Ella, what Shmuel added, lu'uya kohen gadol. If there was the Beis Hamikdash around by Rebbe's time, Rebbe would have allowed this woman to marry the Kohen Gadol, because she was a bia shaloi kedarka by an animal, doesn't answer her from the Kohen Gadol. Amolei Rava mipirkin. Rava from the city of Pirkin or Parskaya, the Ravashi. This Rava said to Ravashi, Menaha amilsa. How do we know this concept? The Amar Rabbanim ein znus lebehema. There's no such a thing as znus by a behema. You don't call it a zoina. Because the pasuk says, "Loisabi esnes zoina umechir kalev." Beis Hashem lekecha. The Torah says that a zoina who received, let's say, a sheep as payment for her services, she should not bring it up to. She cannot use the sheep as a korban. Umechir kalev, or somebody who bartered a dog with a sheep. Guy wanted to trade a dog with your sheep. Once the trade happens, that sheep cannot be used as a korban. Uchnan, and the Mishnah says, Esnan kelev mechir zoina mutarim. The opposite scenario. Esnan kelev. What's an esnan kelev? A man says to a whore, a zoina, here's this sheep. I want you to sleep with my dog, right? So she's going to sleep with a dog, and in exchange, he's giving her a sheep. That's called mechir zoina. That's called esnan kelev. Mechir zoina is that he exchanged a zoina with a tleb. Let's say a zoina was somebody's maid, somebody's shifcha was a zoina, and the guy says, okay, give me that zoina and I'll give you the tleb. So then, mutarim, these cases are permitted. Shnema gam shneyem, shnayim v'lei abah. There's only two scenarios that you can't bring a korban. It's esnan zoina mechir kelev, but not the other way around. So from this brisa we learn, and this is where we'll stop, from that fact that he gave her exchange. He told the zoina, here's the sheep and have relations with my dog. That sheep is permitted to bring as a korban because she's having relations with a dog. That's not called znus. and therefore that's not called. There's no such thing as nus with a behema. So that the payment that she got is kosher to be brought as a carbon. The only thing that's not kosher to be brought as a carbon if she had znus with a human being. But if she had znus with a behema and she got payment for that, that's permitted to be brought as a carbon. So we see from there that there's no such a thing of znus by a behema, and she's not called a zoina just because doing it with an animal. And therefore, we get back to what we said. Rav Shimi Bar Chia said, if a woman had relations with an animal, as long as she's a virgin, or even for a regular kohen, he can't marry a zaina. So this would remain kosher for a kohen. Okay.